All right, we are up to topic 3.3, titled Taxation Without Representation, and we're closing in ever closer to the American Revolution. So let's get into it. So our guiding question for this topic is, how and why did British colonial policies help lead to the Revolutionary War? Let's find out. Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some sources of colonial dissent. In other words, why were the colonists unhappy? Where did that unhappiness come from? And just a couple notes here first before we get into some specific events. By the point of the mid-1700s, Americans had been on this side of the ocean for over a century. They were kind of used to doing their own thing. Think back to salutary neglect, for example. We'd kind of gotten used to the British letting us kind of get away with stuff, basically. Britain's way over on the other side of the ocean, and as we know, distance obviously is going to weaken authority. The further you get away from the source of authority, the less authority that they have. We also resent British control over our economy with mercantilism. Remember, in the system of mercantilism, the mother country, that's Britain, the only reason really they're building colonies is to make money. We exist to enrich the mother country by buying their finished goods and selling them our raw materials. Furthermore, the British held on to the right to veto any laws passed by our colonial assemblies. So even our self-government has some major limits on it. The British could, for whatever reason, decide to cancel whatever, say, the House of Burgesses decided what to do. Another source of dissent would be the spread of the Enlightenment. This is, of course, an intellectual movement that began late 1600s, goes all the way through the 1700s in Europe, included British and French and Italian and other, German as well, thinkers. This would include ideas such as natural rights. That's a John Locke idea. Life, liberty, and property, he said, every human has. Then there's the idea of the consent of the governed, which would be basically a Jean-Jacques Rousseau idea of the social contract, where people come together and form a government that listens to their will. There's also the idea of a separation of powers. This we can attribute to the Baron Montesquieu, a French philosopher. And then there's also the idea of due process, that you have, the government should respect your liberty, and if they're going to take the liberty away, they have to show they have rightful cause through a trial. All right, now into some of the big events. And we're going to talk about the Stamp Act. And before we get to the Stamp Act, though, let's just talk in general how and why the British were deeply in debt in the 1760s. And if you're thinking why, and you're also thinking French and Indian War, you are right. That war, while victorious, cost the British a bunch of money. And they have a debt of nearly 150 million pounds, which was a lot of money back then. About half of their debt is coming from defending the American colonies, because they gained so much land from France, but they also have to defend all that extra land against Native American attacks, or say Spanish incursions, or maybe French, revenge or whatever. It costs a lot of money, and so they've got to pay down that debt. So in 1764, this is the year after the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War ended, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act. And what this does is it places a tax on foreign sugar imports. This is part of mercantilism, after all. They want you to buy British sugar, not French or Dutch sugar or something like that. And this is also the first tax that was passed exclusively for raising revenues for the crown. In other words, previous taxes, much of that money had stayed in the colonies. So as an American colonist, you pay your tax, and at least you see that tax money going to help the community around you. But now this money's flowing back to Britain, and it's helping King George pay off his debt and other such things, and you don't much care for that. A year later, the British passed the Stamp Act in 1765. This is going to raise money to support the British military, help pay down that debt, and also maintain their presence in North America. This would involve having to buy revenue stamps when you publish certain documents or purchase certain goods. You had to have the stamp for that transaction to be legal. Now, the idea of a Stamp Act was nothing new. The British were already paying a Stamp Act in Britain on certain goods, so the British thought the Americans should follow suit as well. So why were Americans upset then? Why did we not want to pay the tax? Is it just the fact that we're being cheap? Well, no, it's not. It's this idea that since we had no voting representation in Parliament and Parliament passed the tax, then we shouldn't have to pay the tax. We cried foul. We said there should be no taxation without representation. And furthermore, only local elected colonial assemblies who represent their people in the colony should be able to pass taxation. So we were pretty upset about this. The British would respond by saying, well, you do have representation. They believed in this thing called virtual representation, where the members of Parliament represented all British citizens everywhere. So that was kind of the British way to get around this sticking point. Well, we were pretty upset between the Sugar and Stamp Act, and so in 1765, the Americans hold a Stamp Act Congress in New York. 9 of the 13 colonies send delegates. There's about two dozen different delegates, and they draw up a statement of rights, and they ask the Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Can you please rethink this? The British, they're going to ignore us, basically. So if the British don't back down, and they don't refuse to, forego the Stamp Act, what can we do to protest the Stamp Act is the big question. And this, of course, involves resistance to the Stamp Act. And there's 2 major forms of resistance. You can go the active route, which you can see on the right, and then the passive route. And the passive, of course, is a nonviolent way. You're trying to seize the moral high ground, trying to convince the other side that they should change their mind, but you're not threatening the other side. Active resistance would be using violence, threat of violence, property destruction, you name it, to get your way. All right, so one of the things the American colonies are going to do in response to the Stamp Act is agree to these non-importation agreements. We would agree to not import British goods, to make our own goods the best we can anyways, even though we don't have a lot of manufacturing capability. We're going to make our own clothing, for example, so making your own clothing became patriotic. You were showing that you believed in the American cause. And this is, it's something that gets all Americans, at least the ones who sign up for this, involved, and it kind of pushes the colonies together into unity behind this cause. Now, on the more active side of resistance, you have the Sons of Liberty, and the Sons of Liberty were an organization that sprang up in New England. They are going to resist this boycott using violence. This could be tarring and feathering of colonial officials, of tax collectors. This could be burning effigies. This could be literally just going in and destroying royal officials' homes and tax collectors' homes to intimidate them into not enforcing the Stamp Act. Again, tarring and feathering, we've seen this before, and we'll see it again in the future. So, what happens with all these protests, whether they're passive or active? Well, tax collectors were afraid to actually do their job, so many of them resigned. Others just simply stopped doing their job. So the Stamp Act was not producing a lot of revenue for Britain. In fact, probably quite the opposite. A lot of Americans simply disobeyed the law openly and flagrantly. And the British are starting to see that maybe this is not the best path forward. So in 1766, the British basically agreed to repeal the Stamp Act. And the painting you're looking at, that's a statue of King George III, our king at this time. That was erected in New York as a sign of happiness and joy with the king that he had seen fit to repeal this Stamp Act. If you were to jump ahead about 10 years into the future, that same statue would be torn down, as you can see in the painting. It was a lead statue, and it was melted down and turned into bullets to shoot at the British, which I find pretty ironic and rather amusing. Now, the British may have backed down, but they didn't back down entirely. Yes, the Stamp Act is gone, but they followed up with the Declaratory Act, and the Declaratory Act simply said that going forward, the British Parliament reserved the right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In other words, going forward, the Parliament will not back down, and we reserve the right to control the colonies by force if necessary, and the colonies are expected to fall in line. So the British have basically drawn a line in the sand and told the colonists, you can't go past this line. We may have backed down one time, but we're not going to back down again. So, quick review. We saw in 1764 the Sugar Act, then the Stamp Act in 1765, followed by the Declaratory Act in 1766. 1767 saw the Townshend Acts passed, and this would be an import tax on various goods like glass, paper, paint, and tea. And Americans were pretty upset about taxes, especially a tax on tea. That was not cool. Britain, what are you thinking? Well, resistance grew to the tax, and in 1768 the British sent over 2 regiments of their redcoats, which are infantry, right? British soldiers. And they were sent to Boston, which was seen as kind of the hotbed of resistance to the British, and their job was to maintain law and order. Their job was to march around and show the people of Boston that the British were not backing down. They were serious about this stuff. So you've got a combination of anger in Boston along with the presence of armed British soldiers. I think we know where this is going. This is going Boston Massacre, right? March 5th, 1770, a group of American colonists surround a small group of British soldiers. They jeer the soldiers, they throw rocks at the soldiers, they taunt the soldiers, they dare the soldiers to fire, and the soldiers fire, killing 5 Americans and wounding 6 more. Again, Boston Massacre, right? That's what we call this, and this is the famous engraving done by none other than Paul Revere, of Paul Revere's Ride fame. And, was this truly a massacre? Well, let's be honest. The American colonists kind of brought this on themselves. It's kind of hard to defend their actions here. But it was a great propaganda coup for the Sons of Liberty, because they can point to this and say, see, the British are here to kill us. They're not our friends. King George is not our father. What father kills his children, right? That's what they're going to say. Here's a different view of the massacre, showing the soldiers, showing some restraint, and they frankly did, but we'll never know exactly why they fired. It could have been on accident or something. But the point is, this was a major moment. Ironically enough, the colonist that was actually given the job of defending these soldiers was future President John Adams, and he did a very good job of defending these soldiers. They received some punishments, but they didn't, they weren't sent off to prison for life or something like that. All right. Speaking of John Adams, his cousin Samuel Adams, also in Boston, was one of these Sons of Liberty leaders. He was a guy who was always stirring the pot, trying to keep the rebellion going, trying to get people, upset with the British. And in 1772, what he does, he sets up the so-called Committees of Correspondence. Now, correspondence, guys, is just when you send a message back and forth with people, right? You're corresponding with them. Back in the days when people sent letters, of course, not like today. And the purpose of these Committees of Correspondence was to spread that spirit of resistance, to keep up the fight, keep alive the non-importation agreements, and keep alive your resistance to the British. Because Sam Adams knew that in the heat of the moment, right after the Boston Massacre, people are going to be really upset. But then after a couple days, weeks, months, that fire of resistance begins to die down. We had to keep that going. Otherwise, the British might just continue their policies in the future. All right, we're going to stay in Boston now and stay with the topic of tea a little bit longer. So what happens is, about this time, a British company called the British East India Company was facing bankruptcy. It had itself some 17 million pounds of surplus tea that it needed to sell. And some investors of the British East India Company were members of Parliament, and they didn't want to see this company go underwater because, of course, they would lose money. And so the Parliament passes in 1773 the Tea Act, which gave this company, the British East India Company, a complete monopoly over American tea interests. So in other words, they'll become the only source of legal tea in America. And they're going to dump a ton of tea on American shores, which caused the price of tea to plummet. And, of course, Americans are going to be happy about this, right? I mean, cheap tea, right? Low prices. That sounds awesome. No, they're not. And the reason they're not happy about this is, if the British were still requiring us to pay that tax we felt was against our natural rights on the tea. So legal tea with the tax was still cheaper than smuggled tea. And that ticked off Americans because we saw this as some sort of trick into getting us to buy tea and pay the tax we felt was against our natural rights. So in resistance to this, the Sons of Liberty and others organized the famous Boston Tea Party. Although that name, Boston Tea Party, was not used until many years after the fact, what happened is the story you guys have learned since elementary school. A group of colonists boarded British ships in Boston Harbor, dumped some 300 chests of tea into the harbor. Look this up. This would be the equivalent of about $1 million worth of tea in modern dollars. So this is a lot of tea, a lot of lost property. There they are, throwing the cargoes over into the Boston Harbor. All right, so the British have to respond to this because we are, frankly, being unruly. We're being disobedient. We're like that kid who just doesn't ever obey. So what are the British going to do? Well, they respond with the Intolerable Acts of 1774. Now, the British obviously didn't call them the Intolerable Acts. That's what we called them because we thought they were intolerable. In other words, not to be tolerated. In other words, not to be suffered under. So, first one of these was the Boston Port Act. What this said was the Boston Port will be closed until those damages were paid for the lost tea, which means Boston can't trade until they pony up all that money. This would, of course, strike fear into the people of Boston and hurt their economy pretty severely. Other pieces of the puzzle means there's going to be further restrictions on town meetings. There's also going to be a new Quartering Act, which would require American colonists to allow British soldiers to stay in their house with them, which has got to be pretty awkward. And if a royal official were put on trial for killing a colonist in the line of duty, he would be tried not in America any longer, but in England, a clear response to the Boston Massacre. Now, the Americans were especially upset about that because they feared that that person would go back to England and not get a fair trial and be basically acquitted no matter what he did, and American lives would not be avenged. So, we got the Intolerable Acts in front of us, and what do we do to it? What do we do about this? Well, we have another Congress. It's the first Continental Congress, meets in Philadelphia from September to October of 1774. All but Georgia send delegates to this Congress. And what comes out of this is what's known as the Association, which will be this sort of shadowy government. Well, it's not an official government, of course, but it's kind of like a government. And this will oversee a total boycott of British goods. We're not going to import. We're not going to export. We're not going to consume their products. We're going to try to hit the British where it hurts the most, and that is in the wallet. What's important to note, though, is what they didn't call for. While they may have called for a continued importation of a continued ban on importation of British goods, they did not call for independence. Independence, guys, was not on the minds of most American colonists, even the American colonial leaders at this time. Only the most radical of radicals were talking independence, and yet we're only a year out from the Revolution. So that was a quick review, guys, of how and why colonial policies helped lead to the Revolutionary War. We saw a series of acts like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Boston Port Act, which is part of the Declaratory Acts, all these different things all rolled together. Basically, it's just a series of events on the road to increasing those tensions to the point where we decide we can no longer be part of the British Empire, which we'll get into in our next video.